The Reality Czar and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, our producer, Christopher Hopkins. How you doing, Christopher?
I'm good.
And he's on that side of the camera. And we also want to welcome everyone to this podcast. It's called The Reality Czar. We have no dumbest bill in America today because we are building up a huge library, as we have told you before, a huge library of dumbest bills in America. And we will have one coming up tomorrow, which is actually quite hysterical, and it will be from Oklahoma. Yes. So first up, the Reality Czar. John Kerry's climate hustle, right? So John Kerry, naturally, he is one of these big climate folks who believes that we must, as the United States, this country must completely and utterly decarbonize all energy production completely. So why does that matter? Well, the first thing that Biden did naturally was it shut down the Keystone pipeline, right? They shut it down. So you shut down the Keystone pipeline, you put all those people out of work, and you do so based on, you meaning Biden, you do so based on the premise that they are in an industry that is polluting because it is creating carbon emissions, and that is bad according to the Biden administration, even though those carbon emissions are a lot cleaner than other types of carbon emissions, as we all know. But that doesn't stop John Kerry from completely and utterly being a hypocrite, right? Because not too long ago, and by the way, also currently, he takes private jets. So get this. John Kerry took private jet to Iceland for environmental award. So in Iceland, he was going to get an environmental award, and he took a private jet to get there, called it his only choice for somebody like me. So here's the article. It says, President Biden's recently appointed climate czar, John Kerry, by the way, I'm still not sure what a climate czar is, but John Kerry took a private jet to Iceland in 2019, which was a couple of years ago, to receive the Arctic Circle Award for Climate Leadership, Fox News has learned. Kerry defended his high pollution ride at the time, calling it the only choice for somebody like me who's traveling the world to win this battle. In an interview obtained by Fox News, the incident had not been previously reported in the American press. So even though this happened 2 years ago, the incident had not been previously reported in the American press, which is why it is now being finally reported. So why does that matter? Well, because there's a clip that came out about this, and John Kerry talks about his climate hustle and how he was asked the question, why did you take a private jet if you really are concerned about climate change? And, aren't you concerned about your carbon footprint? We have that clip, and here it is.
On that issue, pollution, I understand that you came here with a private jet. Is that an environmental way to travel?
If you offset your carbon, it's the only choice for somebody like me who is traveling the world to win this battle. I negotiated the Paris Accords for the United States. I've been involved in this fight for years. I negotiated with President Xi to bring President Xi to the table so we could get Paris. And I believe the time it takes me to get somewhere, I can't sail across the ocean. I have to fly to meet with people and get things done. But what I'm doing almost full time is working to win the battle of climate change. And in the end, if I offset and contribute my life to do this, I'm not going to be put on the defensive.
By offsetting his carbon, what he's saying is that when he takes the private jet, which of course is incredibly comfortable and not crowded like normal jets you would take with passenger jets where everybody has to get on them and you're just like stuffed in with everyone else, what he's saying is he buys carbon credits. So he buys the credits from someone who is not producing carbon, pays them to not produce carbon so that John Kerry can produce carbon so that he can tell everybody else not to produce carbon. That is exactly what he's saying here. So Ted Cruz, of course, as you might expect, ripped John Kerry. He blasts Kerry for being arrogant and called his statement about solar power jobs really arrogant and a better choice for workers. We have a number of clips on this. They're right from John Kerry's mouth. You can't believe it. But of course, Cruz went right after him. It's just like, this guy, what is it about Democrats? They don't really care about jobs, but they also don't seem to care about our stability and our economic stability and our ability to compete internationally and globally on trade and on other competitive items. So here is Kerry's first comments about the Keystone pipeline that was shut down. And Kerry says, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about coal. Don't worry about natural gas. Don't worry about those jobs. We've got solar jobs. Those are great jobs. We have that clip, and here it is.
And the President of the United States has expressed in every comment he has made about climate the need to grow the new jobs that pay better, that are cleaner. That, I mean, you look at the consequences of black lung for a miner, for instance, and measure that against the fastest growing job in the United States before COVID was solar power technician. The same people can do those jobs, but the choice of doing the solar power one now is a better choice.
These solar power jobs, according to good old John Kerry, the climate czar, is that those are better choices. Those are better jobs. In other words, the people who work on the Keystone pipeline and in the natural gas industry and the people that work in coal mines, they must make better choices. Like, John Kerry, who has a private jet at his disposal, but it's okay because he buys carbon credits. But it's not okay to have a job if you're middle America because, they're not the right jobs. They're not the woke jobs. So he's saying solar power jobs are better jobs. So let's think about this for a moment. So first you make the solar panels. For the most part, they are not made here in the United States. They're made overseas in China and elsewhere. And the next thing is you have to install the solar panels, right? Well, those jobs are not great paying jobs. And quite frankly, once those solar panels are installed, there's not a whole lot left to do once they're installed. And they're also not renewable. Podcast listeners, let me ask you a question. Why are solar panels not renewable? Because after 20 years, they have to be what? Replaced. What do you do with the old solar panels? Well, if you ask the climatologist, well, you just renew them. They're just renewable. They just keep going forever. Or you say, well, no, what do you really do with them? Oh, you recycle them. No, actually, you can't recycle them. They're actually put in landfills. They're put in landfills. So Kerry, of course, completely lies about it. Of course, it's the continued climate hustle. So then Kerry says, it's not just solar jobs that are the best, it's also wind turbines. We have a clip on that, and here it is.
The second fastest growing job pre-COVID was wind turbine technician.
Pre-COVID.
This is happening. 75%, 70% of all the electricity that's come online in the United States in the last few years came from renewables. Coal plants have been closing over the last 20 years. So what President Biden wants to do is make sure those folks have better choices, that they have alternatives, that they can be the people who go to work to make the solar panels. They were making them here at home. That is going to be a particular focus of the Build Back Better agenda.
So once again, wind turbines. You must work on wind turbines. You must get into that industry because that would be a better choice. Then he continues to say, well, more electricity has been produced by renewables than in any other plant. Well, that's because under Obama, and now, of course, under Biden, they have shut down power plants. And they're trying to shut down power plants. They're trying to shut down all kinds of energy that has to do with any kind of carbon pollution. They're trying to just completely get rid of them. And the reason why you might have an increase in jobs in wind turbine construction or manufacturing or in solar manufacturing or solar installation is because of government, not because of the market. The market isn't demanding it. It's the government that's making the market demand it. And everybody knows it because they put in these massive incentives, all kinds of carbon credit incentives and tax incentives so that the richest of the rich on Wall Street can then invest in these things knowing that their real customer isn't you. The real customer is the government who's paying them. This is just a hustle between good old climate czar John Kerry and Wall Street. That's all it is. It's exactly what it is. So then Kerry's asked another question. What about, climate and the workers? What about all those workers you're displacing? Well, we had that final clip, and here it is.
And I think that unfortunately workers have been fed a false narrative. No surprise, right, for the last few years. They've been fed the notion that somehow dealing with climate is coming at their expense. No, it's not. What's happening to them is happening because of other market forces already taking place. And what the financiers, the big banks, the asset managers, private investors, venture capital are all discovering is there's a lot of money to be made in the creation of these new jobs.
There's a lot of money to be made by Wall Street because, as I just said, the United States government is actually they're funding all of these institutions and these particular industries. The industries. And how are they doing it? They're doing it by these huge subsidies. They're doing it by carbon tax credits. They're doing it by offsets, kind of like the same carbon offset that John Kerry bought so that he could get on his private jet. So it's the people that are getting enriched by this are the Wall Street friends of John Kerry and Joe Biden and the Democrat Party and the hedge funds. Everybody knows it, except that he's actually admitting it. And he's saying, well, climate policies don't come at the expense of working Americans. Yes, they do, because they just shut down the pipeline and they're trying to shut down coal. So how can they possibly say this? And let me ask you something. If the real culprit in the world is China in terms of carbon emissions, which of course it is, China and India, why would one of your first actions as president of the United States give away one of your biggest levers of power, which is to say, I'm going to shut down coal and I'm going to shut down natural gas? Wouldn't you use that as a leverage point with China and India? But no, instead, Biden shut that down first, and now they're going to go to China and say, hey, would you play with us on the climate, hustle? We need you to shut down all your carbon emissions too. What do you think the Chinese are going to tell them? They're going to say, go pound sand. So in the Wall Street Journal, to prove my point, it says, Biden's China policy to be steered by teams of rivals. So President Biden has stocked his China team with high-powered officials who have long-standing ties to one another but differing objectives. How they work together could determine whether the new administration is a unified China policy or one riven with divisions that Beijing can exploit. Former Secretary of State John Kerry, now the White House's climate envoy, is pursuing an international climate deal that requires the cooperation of China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, to be effective. The White House's China coordinator, Kurt Campbell, meanwhile, wants to push back hard on China. So you have the Biden administration that's already shutting down natural gas. They shut down the Keystone Pipeline. They're trying to shut down, of course, the entire coal industry. They want to get rid of the oil industry, and they want to do that now. And then, after they give away all of that leverage, of course, to China, then they want to go to China and say, hey, China, we need you to do the same thing that we just did. It's like, no. We have one of the cleanest economies on planet Earth, and our carbon emissions continue to decrease. And they continue to decrease because of natural gas. And if we let the market forces work, they will work in our favor because natural gas is actually cheaper. And that is John Kerry's climate hustle. So next up, podcast listeners, listen to this. New York State Senator Thomas O'Mara, who's a Republican, is blocked from subpoenaing nursing home data. So Thomas O'Mara, he's a Republican in the State Assembly in New York, and all he wanted to do in committee was to have the permission to subpoena all of the information about nursing homes. And what Cuomo did, the governor of New York, during the peak COVID months, when Cuomo sent the individuals who had been diagnosed with COVID at the hospital or other testing centers, but they weren't actually sick enough to be hospitalized. So where did he send them? He sent them to the nursing homes. And so Thomas O'Mara, well, of course, then we have to finish the story. So what ended up happening, right? Well, what ended up happening is thousands upon thousands, actually tens of thousands of individuals died. And they were all the elderly in those nursing homes because they're sharing the same building as these patients who are recovering from COVID, but not sick enough to be in the hospital. And so they're sharing the same air, they're catching COVID, and yet they're the ones that are dying, and the people that were put in the nursing homes to recover are the ones that are surviving. So obviously, Cuomo's policy is a complete, and was and still is a complete disaster. And so all Thomas O'Mara, who's a Republican in the state assembly, wants to do in New York State is to have a hearing that allows him and the Democrats and Republicans to look at the data to find out, is it really worse than what we thought? Is it worse than what we thought? Or did they underreport the deaths? Because there's a lot of evidence that the deaths that actually occurred in the nursing homes were way underreported. So here's an example. So someone goes to the hospital, and let's just say they're 40 years old or 50 years old. They are diagnosed with COVID, but the hospital says, well, look, you're not sick enough to be admitted. We need you to go to nursing home X. They send that person to nursing home X. That person stays in nursing home X for 14 days. Meanwhile, 50 people in the nursing home get COVID. Half of them get hospitalized, die in the hospital. But because they died in the hospital, they weren't really marked in New York State as nursing home deaths. They were like, yeah, well, they had COVID and they died, but they died in the hospital, not in the nursing home. So obviously, good old New York Governor Cuomo is trying to hide as much as he can. So Thomas O'Mara, who's the Republican in the State Assembly of New York State, he made a motion in committee about let's subpoena all of this information once and for all and have full transparency. We have that motion that he made on a clip, and here it is.
I would like to move a motion that this committee, by a majority vote, issue a subpoena to produce all records relative to nursing home deaths due to COVID.
I didn't get the courtesy of even a heads up that you'd be making this motion, and instead you decided to ambush me and the committee.
Chairman, if I may be heard.
It has been. You're not recognized, Senator O'Mara.
So that's the committee chairman saying, you're not recognized, Senator O'Mara. So he's actually a senator in the New York Assembly. And you got, look, here's the thing. All he wants, Thomas O'Mara, is to have the information about the nursing homes. So can you imagine being one of the individuals who has parents or a parent who has died in a nursing home, or as a result of the incompetence, and all you want is more transparency and more facts. You have a Republican who's trying to get that information, and then because there's a supermajority in New York of Democrats who control the assembly, right? They control the state and the assembly, as well as the governorship. They control all levers of power. They don't want to let this information out. So here's O'Mara on his motion again. We had that second clip, and here it is.
The bombshell report from the Attorney General last week on the nursing home deaths. So we felt that the appropriate time to finally push the issue. I've been calling, and my colleagues have been calling, for the issuances of these subpoenas and a full investigation of this matter for months now, probably 8-9 months. And we bring up the request for a subpoena. They shut off my microphone. The chairman does not even allow the committee members to take a vote on it based on his counsel telling him there's a rule, but that rule does not exist.
Yeah, so here's an article about this. So New York State's legislature is putting up roadblocks for Republican lawmakers trying to investigate the Cuomo administration's handling of the coronavirus pandemic in nursing homes. New York's Democrat supermajority on Monday blocked a motion to subpoena records of the Cuomo administration. The New York Post reported that the motion was made by Senator Thomas O'Mara, the ranking Republican, on the Investigations Committee panel during a virtual meeting. So the whole purpose of the committee, the Investigations Committee, is to investigate, and they wouldn't let him do it. So O'Mara says, I brought that motion. The chairman of this committee has talked about issuing subpoenas on this matter for months. You know, the bombshell report from the Attorney General last week on the nursing home deaths, so we felt it was the appropriate time to finally push the issue, O'Mara said. So that's because the AG had started reporting information about all of the nursing home deaths and the fact that they were grossly underreported. And so do we know today how many people in New York died as a result of the mismanagement of the governor of New York to put nursing home patients together with COVID patients and vice versa? We do not. We do not have that information. And the chances are, quite frankly, that we're never going to get it. Why? Because Governor Cuomo wants to run for president. And as long as this information is suppressed, that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing for him, terrible thing for the citizens of New York. And you wonder why people are leaving in droves. Well, here's one reason right here. So O'Mara also talks about the issue of sending COVID patients directly into those nursing homes. And he just kind of frames the issue, which one which we've already talked about many times before in this podcast, but it's just interesting to finally hear that people are speaking up that are elected officials in New York State, and they're trying to do something about it. And here is that final clip. Here it is.
The AG was Governor Cuomo's handpicked Attorney General candidate just 2 years ago. It's time that we find out really what the truth is here and just how devastating the governor's March 25th order to send COVID-positive patients into nursing homes, like fire on dry grass, is the way the governor described the concern over nursing homes and COVID back then. Yet he ordered those positive patients into nursing homes.
It just shows you that the governor of New York, right, as well as the Democrats who control the legislature in New York, they are just so phony when it comes to how much they care about COVID deaths, right? It's like, oh my gosh, Donald Trump, he just did a terrible job. I mean, we have all these people that have died in the state of New York from COVID. And meanwhile, many of them, right, the lion's share of these individuals who passed were in some way or another connected to nursing homes. So we don't have that data. As long as we don't get that data, we're not going to be able to hold Cuomo accountable, which of course, he's not going to be held accountable. I'm convinced of it, because he's going to make sure this information never gets out, because Cuomo, as I said before, wants to run for president of the United States. And that is New York State. Senator Thomas O'Mara is blocked from getting information about nursing home data. So next up, podcast listeners, we have New York Times to Biden. Appoint a reality czar. So get this, the New York Times is telling Joe Biden, you need to appoint a reality czar. What the heck is a reality czar? Well, good old New York Times decided to write, a piece on this. And we have that, and it is by Kevin Roose, okay? So Kevin Roose in the New York Times, his article is entitled, How the Biden Administration Can Help Solve Our Reality Crisis. And it says, the byline, these steps, experts say, I love that, could prod more people to abandon the scourge of hoaxes and lies. And the article reads as follows, the first part, it says, last month, millions of Americans watched as President Biden took the oath of office and in a high-minded inaugural address called for a new era of American unity. They may have watched on TV, but they certainly didn't watch in person because, there's basically an occupation by the United States military to prevent you from getting into the city. Still, by the way. But plenty of other Americans weren't paying attention to Mr. Biden's speech. They were too busy watching YouTube videos alleging that the inauguration was a pre-recorded hoax that had been filmed on a Hollywood soundstage. Or they were melting down in QAnon group chats trying to figure out why former President Donald Trump wasn't interrupting Mr. Biden's speech to declare martial law and announce the mass arrest of satanic pedophiles. So basically, this guy, Kevin Roose of the New York Times, is talking about QAnon, right? And he's trying to lump every single person who voted for Donald Trump into being someone who watches or looks at the QAnon stuff, which we all know isn't true. Look, if you watch QAnon, to me, it's obviously, and I think it's pretty clear, it's obviously nonsense. Right? It's clearly not true. Let's say that again. QAnon information is clearly not true. But this particular writer, Mr. Roose, decides to say, well, all Republicans who voted for Donald Trump, they ascribe to that. And therefore, good old Joe Biden must appoint a reality czar. So here are his specific suggestions. He says, several experts I spoke with, several experts recommend, you ever notice they never actually cite who the experts are? Several experts I spoke with recommended that the Biden administration put together a cross-agency task force to tackle disinformation and domestic extremism, which would be led by something like a reality czar. It sounds a little dystopian, I'll grant, but let's hear them out. Right now, these experts said the federal government's response to disinformation and domestic extremism is haphazard and spread across multiple agencies, and there's a lot of unnecessary overlap. Renee DiResta, a disinformation researcher at Stanford's Internet Observatory, gave the example of two seemingly unrelated problems: misinformation about COVID-19 and misinformation about election fraud. Often, she said, the same people and groups are responsible for spreading both types. So instead of two parallel processes, one at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention aimed at tamping down COVID-related conspiracy theories, and another at the Federal Election Commission trying to correct voting misinformation, a centralized task force could coordinate a single strategic response. I mean, basically, he's saying the only way that you can get the correct information out is if you have, kind of like a reality star. I'm not sure if it's a reality TV star. And the purpose of the reality TV star is to do what? Is to be the only person you can go to, to get the information. And of course, AOC talked about the Ministry of Truth, so this is kind of the same thing. So Mr. Ruse of the New York Times continues. He also says we need to audit the algorithms. Listen to this. Several experts recommended that Biden administration push for more transparency into the inner workings of the black box algorithms that Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and other major platforms use to rank feeds, recommend content, and usher users into private groups, many of which have been responsible for amplifying conspiracy theories and extremist views. We must open the hood on social media so that civil rights lawyers and real watchdog organizations can investigate human rights abuses enabled or amplified by technology, Dr. Donovan said. So here's what he's saying. He's saying that the algorithms written by YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, so forth, they're written to push you in the direction of only going to places where you agree. And it's really interesting because on the right side of the aisle, what you have Republicans saying is, well, we think that the information isn't even being available to us because, they pulled down Parler. And I have no doubt they'd love to pull down Rumble. And I have no doubt that when you go into Google and you search things, you're not finding the things that you're looking for many times, especially if they have to do with conservative ideas and conservative views. So there's a lot of shadow banning going on. And so this gentleman's like, well, the way you do that is you appoint a Reality Czar at the federal government, and that just fixes everything. But that's just not enough. So in the Business Insider, Biden's press office asked journalists to send questions in advance, drawing mixed reactions from reporters. So here's what's interesting. Here's the divide, right? On the one hand, New York Times is like, appoint a Reality Czar because you guys have all the right information in the Biden administration. And then on the other side, you have Jen Psaki, who is Biden's press secretary, saying, hey, can you guys, send the questions to us in advance? Because we actually don't know the answers. And we want to get a heads up of what the questions are so we know how to craft an answer well in advance. And it's kind of just so phony, right? And so if that isn't enough, if you want to know how dangerous all this potentially is, there's an article out that says YouTube cancels the Senate. So YouTube cancels the Senate. So what does that mean? So apparently YouTube has decided that they are going to stop showing Senate information regarding the Biden administration. And so here's the article. YouTube cancels the US Senate, and it's in the Wall Street Journal. This is brand new, right off the press. So get this, podcast listeners. If you think the algorithm idea is scary enough and the Reality Czar is scary enough, so here's in the Wall Street Journal today. Google's YouTube, because YouTube's owned by Google, has ratcheted up censorship to a new level by removing 2 videos from the United States Senate Committee. This is the United States government, the Senate Committee. And these YouTubes were taken in the United States Senate, its actual testimony. YouTube has removed that testimony. They were from a December 8th committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs hearing on early treatment of COVID-19. One was a 30-minute summary, and the other was the opening statement of critical care specialist Pierre Kory. Dr. Kory is one of the world-renowned group of physicians who developed a groundbreaking use of corticosteroids to treat hospitalized COVID patients. His testimony at a May Senate hearing helped doctors rethink treatment protocols and actually saved lives. At the December hearing, he presented evidence regarding the use of ivermectin, a cheap and widely available drug that treats tropical diseases caused by parasites, for prevention and early treatment of COVID-19. he described a just published study from Argentina in which about 800 healthcare workers received that medicine and 400 didn't. Not one of the 800 contracted COVID-19. 58% of the 400 did. So Dr. Corey asked the National Institutes of Health to review his group's manuscript outlining dozens of successful trials and to consider updating its August 27th guidance in which he recommended against the use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19 except in a clinical trial. On December 10th, Senator Rand Paul and I sent a letter to NIH requesting that it review Dr. Corey's evidence. So this particular article in the Wall Street Journal was written by it was written by Ron Johnson, Senator Ron Johnson. And the article goes on, and here's the thing. Google has taken down all of that testimony video. Why did they take it down? I mean, in other words, here is the ultimate in transparency, a doctor who's world-renowned talking about a different way of treating COVID that's a lot cheaper and a lot faster and doesn't involve a vaccine. And as a result, YouTube said, no, that's just like going to create too much misinformation. So we're going to just get rid of it. So the New York Times wants a reality czar. I mean, what's the reality czar going to do? Cooperate and collude with YouTube and Google and Facebook and Apple and Twitter? Of course they are. That's exactly what they're going to do. And they're going to make things worse. How about if we just let the information out there and let people pick and choose and just, whatever happens, happens, right? Because what's the danger of letting people read what they want to read? Yet, the New York Times wants there to be a reality czar. And that is New York Times to Biden. Please point the reality czar. So next up, podcast listeners, Jen Psaki makes fun of Space Force. Yes, so Jen Psaki, who is the press secretary for President Joe Biden, is asked a question about Space Force and kind of, like what's going on with Space Force, Mrs. Psaki? And she answers the question in a very flippant way and basically makes complete fun of Space Force. We had that clip, and here it is.
Soon. May I ask whether the president has made a decision on keeping the scope of Space Force?
Wow, Space Force. It's the plane of today. It is an interesting question. I am happy to check with our Space Force point of contact. I'm not sure who that is. I will find out and see if we have any update on that.
So that's Jen Psaki making fun of Space Force. It's like, oh, Space Force. Well, I'm not sure if there's anyone that's going to answer the phone over there because I'm not even sure who to call. So why does this matter, right? It matters a lot because much of the military, much of the wars in the near future, if not now, will be fought in space, right? So there's that, which is why there is a Space Force. And also much of what we need to know about space could help us live better lives here on Earth. Not to mention that a lot of the things that we do in space engage potential possibilities, let's just say, of learning of other life forces or other planets potentially that might host life forces. And I think we all know that that is, much more likely than not. And yet she's making fun of it. And so Space Force was put into place for all kinds of reasons, right? Not just military reasons with respect to the United States versus China and the United States versus Russia, but also potentially, quite frankly, podcast listeners, military reasons as it relates to other forms of life and protecting us against those other forms of life just in case. And to prove the point, there was a documentary that came out not too long ago. It was actually in October. It was called The Phenomenon. Tucker Carlson and others have talked about this. And The Phenomenon is a documentary that literally talks to members of the United States military, past and present, and all kinds of sightings that had occurred since the 40s, right? Especially since after World War II. And they talk about this, and really, we have a clip from the trailer, and we're going to play that for you, and then we'll talk about it briefly and try to turn that into more information about the Space Force. And here it is.
There is an immense array of unanswered questions and an urgent need to get to the bottom of it.
The public has a right to know.
My gosh, look at that thing.
The question is no longer if they are here, but why?
What are they doing? What do they want from us? What are their motivations?
So, you know what? Why wouldn't you want a Space Force? Okay, so part of that documentary, podcast listeners, actually talks to top military brass that said, not just in the United States, but also in the former Soviet Union, right, during the Cold War, there were sightings of unidentified objects above nuclear facilities, right, in Russia and in the United States. By nuclear facilities, I mean where we actually hosted missiles that we had pointed at the Soviet Union and missiles that the Soviet Union had pointed at us. And in the United States, those unidentified objects had actually been switching some of those missiles and activating them potentially, right? In other words, messing with the electronics. And that same exact thing happened in the Soviet Union. And so in the phenomenon, they actually interview generals in the Soviet Union as well as their counterparts in the United States. It's fascinating, right? So yeah, so Jen Psaki can make fun of the Space Force all she wants, but the fact of the matter is it does matter, right? It does matter. And it matters because we want to protect just not ourselves from other countries, but, and spare me, podcast listeners say, oh my God, Mark, you're going crazy. No, we're not, because all we're saying is, wouldn't you rather be careful? Wouldn't you rather be cautious and careful and have some sort of assurance policy that you have these satellites deep into space to be able to look out, to just find out if there is anything out there and if it's approaching Earth? I mean, would you rather have that and be safe, or would you rather not have that and not be safe? That's all we're saying here. But of course, if you're Jen Psaki, it's like, well, because Trump created the Space Force, it must go. And so if that isn't enough, CNBC has an article that came out, and this is all interrelated. It says the Justice Department is investigating SpaceX following the complaint of hiring discrimination. So SpaceX. So what is SpaceX? Does anyone know? SpaceX is owned by, of course, none other than Elon Musk. And of course, Elon Musk is being charged with not hiring people because they might not be American citizens. I'm going to tie all this in, I promise. And so CNBC, Justice Department investigating Elon Musk's SpaceX following a complaint or complaints of hiring discrimination. But see, you have to look a lot closer to the article, not just read the title. The U.S. Department of Justice is investigating SpaceX over whether the company discriminates against, get this, podcast listeners, non-U.S. citizens in its hiring practice. The United States government is investigating whether Elon Musk's SpaceX is discriminating against non-U.S. citizens. In other words, it's not hiring them in its practices when it hires employees. Since when do you get to hire a non-citizen in what is a critical industry, right? So there's no doubt all the criticism that you want to give to Elon Musk is fine, but there's no doubt that Elon Musk is in cutting edge technologies at SpaceX, right? I mean, how often do you see a rocket land and it can actually be reused, right? I mean, like never until Elon Musk. And so he's basically not hiring people who come to his company, they want a job, and they're not American citizens. The Justice Department under Biden is coming after him, and they're coming after SpaceX saying, you can't do that. You can't do that. That is illegal. We're coming after you. And so it matters, podcast listeners, because this is national security stuff. A lot of what he is doing at SpaceX is being funded by the taxpayers of the United States. We don't want foreign nationals in the United States working at SpaceX. I don't want them there, right? Because there are a lot of things they're doing for the Pentagon. There are a lot of things they're doing that are far-reaching, and we would like to be the ones to know in the United States and to benefit from these technologies and not have them transferred to China or other countries. So, of course, the Biden administration, all they care about is, you're not hiring illegals, and that's wrong. It's just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So Biden, in conjunction with that, signed an executive order to address the moral failing of Trump's policies. And so what are those policies? Well, the moral failing of Trump's policies have to do with, of course, illegal immigration. So President Joe Biden signed 3 major executive orders this past Tuesday aimed at reversing former President Donald Trump's hardline immigration practices. One executive order will create a task force to reunite children who were separated from their parents under Trump's zero-tolerance policy, which an administration called a moral failing. The task force will be chaired by the Homeland Security Secretary. President Trump was so focused on the wall that he did nothing to address the root causes of why people are coming to our southern border. It was a limited, wasteful, and naive strategy, and it failed, a senior administration official said. People continue to migrate to the United States even today because of it. President Biden's approach is to deal with immigration comprehensively, fairly, and humanely. Nonsense, right? The reason why people are coming across the border into the United States is because Joe Biden's administration is suing companies like SpaceX and saying, why aren't you hiring illegals? You know how you stop the illegal immigration? You stop people from hiring illegals who are coming across the border, and then obviously they're going to migrate back. Do we need a more comprehensive strategy to help people who are in their own countries? Yes, we do, but every time we seem to transfer money or services to those countries, the kleptocracies that run those countries steal the money and it ends up in Switzerland. So we need to have border security. We need to have a border wall. But nonetheless, that's interrelated with Jen Psaki, because the fact of the matter is we want to keep our country safe, right? We want to keep our country's secrets safe. And we want to be able to also keep the planet safe. And I think that makes perfect sense. And that was really kind of the driving force behind, Trump's establishment of Space Force. And anyway, in my opinion, this all makes perfect sense. I mean, it makes sense because of the simple fact that we have an opportunity as a country to really find out, of course, what's in space to be able to protect ourselves from our adversaries, whoever they may be, whether they're from Earth or elsewhere. And I just think it makes perfect sense. And it's funny, podcast listeners, don't take my word for it. Watch The Phenomenon, okay? It's a documentary. I've forgotten whether it's on Netflix or if it's on Amazon. I'm not really sure. But go and watch it. Look at it. Follow it online, and it's worth seeing, and then make a judgment for yourself as to whether you think it makes sense or not to keep Space Force. And that's Jen Psaki, makes fun of Space Force. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, when it's back up one day, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.